Hello guys, welcome to another session. In this session, we are going to look into mounting lifecycle methods. We will discuss about each of the methods which is being used within the mounting phase of lifecycle of React component. So let's start the discussion. As I already mentioned that mounting phase contains four stages which is represented in the form of methods and the execution of this method in the same order. First the constructor get executed, then afterwards static get derived state from props gets executed. After that render method gets executed and at last component did mount gets executed. Now let's look closely what actually these methods are. We will start our discussion with constructor. A constructor is a special function that will get called whenever a new component gets created. So here the question is why we actually use the constructor. So to answer your question, I would tell that constructor is being used for initializing the state. It can also be used to bind the event handlers and all the initialization which you want to perform for that particular component. Then constructor is the place. One of the important point to remember over here is that don't use constructor for any of the side effects. Side effects like HTTP request. You don't call any of the HTTP request call within constructor. You have been noticing one more point. Whenever we are creating a class component and we are using the constructor to directly set the state without using the set state method. So this is the first method which is get executed in the mounting phase. So let's now discuss about the static get derived state from prop. This is the second method which is being executed in the life cycle of the component. This method is really very useful when the state of the component depends on change in props over time. Suppose if you have a component, the initial state of the component depends on the props which is being passed to the component. In such scenario, you use this method to set the state. For static get derived state from props method, one point you always remember that this method is a static method, so it doesn't have access to this keyword. So that means you can't call this dot set state in this particular method. Instead, you simply return the object that represents the new state of the component. And this method is also not the right place to call the side effects like HTTP request. Once execution of a static get derived state from props methods get completed, render is the method which is get executed after a static get derived state from props method. So far you already familiar with the render method and you know that render method is the only required method in the class component. In the render method, we simply read this dot props and this dot state and returns the JSX. One thing I wanted to let you know about the render method is it is a pure function. As render function is pure function, so whatever props and state you will give it, it will return the same. So what thing you don't perform within the render method? So within the render method, you don't change state or interact with DOM or make any AJAX call as it is not recommended. There is another point to remember for render method is if render method contains the child component, then children components lifecycle methods are also get executed along with the parent render method. So now let's proceed further and let's talk about component did mount method. Component did mount method is the final method in the mounting phase. This method is called only once in the whole life cycle of the component. This method invokes immediately after a component and all its children component have been rendered to the DOM. So you must be asking what thing we can perform within component did mount method. Then I would say that this method is perfect place to call HTTP request or any side effect. You can interact with DOM or perform any AJAX calls to load data. In a simple term, I can say that component did mount is the perfect place to initialize the DOM nodes and load data by network request. So we have discussed so much of theory about this topic. So let's do some exercises to make our knowledge more intact about this topic. So let's jump into the Visual Studio Code. So we are into the Visual Studio Code. Now what we will do, we will create a component to verify all the methods of mounting stage. So let's create a folder first. We will call it as Lifecycle parent component, and within that we are going to create a file with the same name, Lifecycle parent component.js, and within that we will generate the boilerplate code with the help of snippet. As it is a class component, we will call RCE and enter. So this will give us the class component boilerplate code. So now the next step is to generate the constructor code, as it is the first method which is being executed within the lifecycle method. So rconst we will generate with the snippet, and over here we will specify the name and we will tell that parent component. This is just for demonstration purpose, and here I will console log it so that we will verify that which method is being called while doing the mounting. So here we will tell that parent component constructor. Save it. Next, let's introduce the static get derived state from props. So this static method which is being called, this method will accept props and state, and it should either return new state or null. To keep our example simple, we will return null. So let's return null over here. And prior to that, we will also console log called parent get derived state from prop method call, so that we can verify that when this method gets called while execution. Now the next method which is being called is the render method. So let's go to the render method, and also here we will tell that console.log parent component render method call. And over here we will specify parent component for a placeholder. And at last, in the mounting stage, the method which is being called is the component did mount. So let's write it. We will tell that component did mount, and here we need to specify console.log, and within that we will tell that parent component did mount call. Save it. Now let's look into the output to verify the execution of the mounting stage. But prior to that, make sure that you are adding into the app.js. So let's comment this one and let's add lc parent component, and over here it has added the path because of auto import extension. Now save it. So let's look into the output now. So over here you will find that the constructor gets called first, then get derived state from props method gets called second. After that, render method gets called. And at last you will find that component did mount method gets called. So this is the order of the execution of the methods within mounting stage. So let's proceed further. Now suppose if we are having a child component, then what would be the execution order? So let's create a child component. So to create the child component, we should select over here, create a folder called Lifecycle child component, and within that we are going to create a file called lc child component.js, and we will generate the snippet RCE, and this will give us the boilerplate code for the class component. And over here we will keep all the console log which we have used over here. So grab it and we will do certain modification. So copy this one, and over here we will come and paste it, and within that we are going to tell that child component. Over here we need to specify child. Here we should also mention child. This will also contain child. This is going to be child component. Let's save it. Now let's look into the output. Now let's put this component into the parent component. Over here we need to specify within the div. So here we will tell that first we will use the parenthesis, and within that then this div we are going to use it, and we will tell that lc child component. Save it. Let's look into the output. Then you will find it over here. First parent constructor get executed, then get derived state from prop gets executed. After that, within the render function, it calls the child component constructor. Then child get derived state from prop method gets called. Then render method of child component gets called. Then the child component did mount method gets called. And at last, parent component did mount method gets called. So this is the order of the execution within the mounting stage when it contains the child component. So now with the help of this example, we come to know about what is the order of execution at mounting stage, and this will help us to write more robust code. So this is what I wanted to demonstrate you in this session. In the next session, we will look into updating stage methods and their order of execution. So on this note, I am stopping over here. See you in the next session. Till then, bye bye. Take care.